quorum is called to order. The time is 6 p.m. Before we begin, council, please put away cell phones. If you have personal business during this meeting, please move for a recess. As a reminder to all attendees, this meeting is being streamed live. The camera is located directly in the back of the council chambers above the clock. Madam Deputy Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Cottle?
Here.
Councilmember Graham?
Here.
Councilmember Johnson?
He said he'd be here in 10 minutes.
Okay. Councilmember Crafton?
Here.
Councilmember Velock?
Here.
Councilmember Rubio?
Here.
You do have a quorum, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and Nikki, would you lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. The first item of business is approval of the agenda. Are there changes to the agenda? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as presented. We are now at persons to be heard, a time for members of the public to share their views for the council. This is not a question and answer period or a time for dialogue. Speakers may be referred to administration, or issues raised may be taken under advisement by the council or administration. There is no one on the sign-up sheet, so we will move on. We will close public participation and move on to unfinished business. Madam Deputy Clerk, please read the item by title.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is discussion, consideration, and possible action on the draft rewrite of Wasilla Municipal Code Title 16 Land Development Code that repeals and reenacts Title 16 to substantially change the uses permitted in each zoning district, the review, enforcement, and permitting procedures, the planned unit development, landscaping, parking, conditional use, and variance procedures, and the design standards imposed in the city. It's the committee of the whole item.
Okay, thank you. Is there a motion to enter the committee of the whole?
Madam Mayor, I move we enter the committee of the whole.
Is there a second?
Madam Mayor, second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Velock and seconded by Councilmember Cottle to enter the committee of the whole. Is there objection to the motion?
Madam Mayor, I would like to note that city staff should be included in the committee of the whole.
Okay. Okay, we hear none. We're now in committee of the whole. The time is 6:03. Holly.
Yes, hello. Okay, so we are going to try to move through both Division 4, Division 5, and maybe even Division 6 today. So we're going to move pretty quickly. I'm counting on council to slow me down if we need to do that. But I think the notice was for 6 to 8 tonight. Is that correct, Mayor?
Right.
So we are limited. So we're going to move as quickly as we can. And so with that said, we are in the middle of our PowerPoint. We're on slide number 14 for the Division 3 and 4 PowerPoint. And then we will move to a new PowerPoint, which is for Division 5 and 6, if we get that far. So I'm going to give you just a moment to sort of get there so we can all follow along. Okay.
Does anyone need a copy of the PowerPoint, the Division 3 and 4?
I have mine.
I could use
I could use 3, 4.
Here.
Let's see, too.
She's got it already.
Oh. How many needs one? 2?
Well, 3 maybe.
Okay, I'm going to give you some other pages once we get a little closer, just so everyone can be flipping to the right sections in your binder.
Yes.
Okay. So the page number for the beginning of the landscaping standards in the clean version of the rewrite is 103. And the page for the beginning of the red line version is 207. Okay, and page 14 of the PowerPoint, and I am going to jump in. Actually, I'll maybe wait one moment so everybody sort of has handout. I know we all have degenerative eyes as well as aging individuals. Okay. So the landscaping standards provision has been comprehensively revised to adopt a landscaping plan that respects the use of native vegetation while imposing criteria on landscaping within the city that will promote and further the development and beautification provisions of the comp plan. So the goal, as council and the planning commission stated in their joint meeting, was please make something simple that does preserve some landscaping standards, but is common sense based and recognizes the native vegetation here and the challenges posed by snow removal. In accordance with that, when we worked through this, I worked with the administration, I worked with Crystal and Eric, and also we got input from the Menard Center, and tried to really look at what's going on in parking lots, which was a big disconnect in some of the provisions. And ultimately, we took what was over 30 pages and reduced it to 10. So this is a pretty significant reduction in regulation when we look at landscaping.
Councilmember Johnson has arrived at 6:07.
Madam Mayor and the council, I apologize for being late.
So Councilmember Johnson, we are just jumping into the landscaping standards, and you'll have 2 PowerPoints in front of you, I think. Okay, so we are in the 3 and 4, and we're on slide number 15. So the slide 15 just provides all of the chapters in the landscaping section. So even though we reduced substantially the number of pages, we have maintained a lot of, we tried really hard to create titles and separate the standards and criteria so users of the code can get to things more quickly. So we have the purpose of the landscaping standards, the applicability of the standards, exemptions from the standards, landscape plan, and what that really looks like, general requirements and standards, and then we have specific landscaping standards for specific situations that are separated out, namely parking, buffer landscaping, and residential. We have a separate section for inspection, a separate section for maintenance and replacement, which that was a pretty specific request coming from council and the commission. And we have a waiver from landscaping standards section, as well as our violations and our penalties. So I'm going to run through the substantive changes for the landscaping standards, and after 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4, we'll see how gauge how we're doing. I will pause for a minute so we can focus on them. So while the proposed code exempts single-family dwelling units and duplexes from submitting a landscaping plan, it imposes the provisions of the chapter on all properties within the city except temporary uses approved by a temporary use permit, airport leases, and areas authorized by the city for public or private parks, golf courses, playing fields, or playgrounds that will be retained in what is called pervious ground cover. And that is because the landscaping is so unique to those particular types of property. Including them in the code just makes it very difficult because we would have to have a separate section, and each one is distinct. Most of the time, they require permitting, and so we get some control there. The planning commission won't be able to. But a golf course is going to look like a golf course, so we're not going to delve into that. The code expressly requires design to take into account existing trees and incorporate existing trees and vegetation where practical. there's a clear cutting prohibition similar to that imposed under the existing code, but it limits the prohibition to areas within 75 feet from the high water mark of any body of water. So that's reduced from what we had before, but it remains for those specific areas. Developers and owners and occupants are prohibited from removing vegetation on undeveloped residential zoned lot where the removal will result in the retention of less than 15% of the vegetation on the lot, on a lot under 40,000 square feet, or less than 20% retention on a lot over 40,000 square feet. So when coming up with this, I did not come up with this as an attorney. I can, hopefully that gives you some comfort. What we did was, Eric pulled up the, I guess I would call them aerial maps or sort of the satellite imagery, so we could actually look at how individuals are using their residential property. And this is a reflection, for the most part, on what the use actually is in Wasilla. So this should not put a large burden on many or anyone, because this is really commensurate with what is currently happening. And when you see a lot that is not complying with this, it is notable. It is a noticeable change, because there is this, you usually see this. So it's not an onerous and it's not intended to be an onerous requirement, but it does set a standard. So it's something for council to think about.
So Holly?
Yes.
The proposed code, it says 75 feet high water mark of any body of water, and then it talks about 15 or 20% of the vegetation. Does it talk about removal of vegetation within X many feet of the high water mark? It talks about clear cutting. Well, clear cutting is different than removing 80% of the vegetation. Or, is there some buffer there? Eric can speak to the need for the vegetation to be able to filter out contaminants on its way to the lake or the river. Is there any provision here to that? Or?
I think that our provisions, let me go in and look and make sure before I respond on exactly what the provisions are surrounding the, because I think we have buffer landscaping, we have the protection from clear cutting, and so if we go to 1680.025, so it's native vegetation shall be preserved, and there shall be no clear cutting in any area of a lot that is within 75 feet of the mean high water mark of any body of water, including a lake, stream, creek, or river. However, minimal areas may be cleared to allow access to docks, boathouses, water's edge. So what this means is you have to maintain the native vegetation in that area. And so it does do what you're saying. It prevents them from doing really anything in that 75 foot except for minimal areas cleared for access. So, and as they're developing, right, they have a permit. So we'll see that development if they have a dock or they have that
So
access.
is that in compliance with the current borough code, the 75 foot? Or is this different than the current borough code of 75? I know they're looking at changing that, but.
I think this is in compliance with the law as it stands now.
Okay. Thank you.
And so we are, so while the numbers you'll see in the landscaping standards, a lot of them originated in other communities, we did take time, so this is really just letting you know that here, we actually did the research to try to come up with these numbers based on what Wasilla needs. So as you move through, if you see a number that doesn't seem quite right or doesn't, or is too much of a deviation, we should, one of the things we have staff here, which is great because I think we'll work through that and talk about it. But some of the areas I'll flag for you if you remember, and I'll be like, I came up with that number. out of air, you know, or based on this. And so it's just important for you to know where things are coming from. Residential lots are also required to have ground cover, but it is not limited to lawn coverage. If you remember before, there was this unexpected emphasis on lawn coverage, which in a environment like Wasilla, that's a difficult landscaping requirement to comply with, where we're not in the world in Alaska of perfectly manicured lawns. We have other ways that that properties will maintain sort of natural landscaping. So we allowed for that, made changes to allow for that. For every 100 lineal feet of frontage along a right-of-way or a portion of a right-of-way, at least one tree meeting the general standards must be retained or planted in the front yard. So again, this was an attempt to make sure the landscaping standards reflected something doable, but also maintained that the sort of comp plan goals regarding aesthetic development.
So Holly, on the bullet there, it talks about residential lots, you know, lawn sod or ground cover. Was ground cover defined to include wild growth areas? Like, that's what we call the area around the library, which is not landscaped per se. I mean, it's a natural landscaping sort of thing. Is that?
No, if there were, in the current landscaping provisions, there are requirements for the use of lawn. And,
Yes.
you know, so that's without any, there's really no
So this one here, where we
flexibility.
say ground cover, are wild growth areas considered ground cover? I guess would be more specific.
We're not specific. We are specific as to what they're required with trees and if they're required to have ground cover, but we are less specific as to what exactly that entails. And so it is much more forgiving, I guess, in that way. But also, at the same time, we do now have landscaping provisions if the proposed section is adopted for residential properties too. So it's so while it's difficult to decipher all of the buffering requirements in current 163360, the buffering requirements proposed in the ordinance only apply when the parking lot is adjacent to a residential zoning district, multifamily housing of 4 units or more is adjacent to an R1 or R2 district, a commercial or industrial use is adjacent to a residential zoning district, or the use is an outdoor storage facility or a kennel, cattery, or warehouse, regardless of the neighborhood for those 3 uses. The general standards retain provisions regulating evergreen tree height, which is a minimum of 6 feet, grass seeding, requires native grass stocks and lawn seed mix, and earthwork erosion protection, but the extremely specific requirements regarding individual trees, tree critical root zones, tree crowns, and maximum disturbance areas of the tree have all been removed. So if you remember all of those all of those picture depictions we have in our current code referring to the tree and exactly what the branches look like, and there's a lot of words in there and a lot of landscaping terms that don't make a lot of sense to the public trying to comply with the code. So that was I think that was a significant emphasis for commission and the council, and so those are gone. But again, we did try to we kept the height, and we kept and maybe this goes, Councilmember Graham, a little to what you're talking about. I mean, we do have earthwork requirements and the mix that's required, and that was based on what was already in our code, and also we cross-referenced any requirement that remained in our landscaping code. We cross-referenced it with numerous Alaska communities in a similar temperature, similar zone. So we were zone 3, and so we made sure we were looking at that, and if they weren't reflected in those other communities, we dug a little deeper, and then often we replaced in those scenarios just to make sure we're sticking with native vegetation. parking lot landscaping is required when a structure is erected with a parking lot of 40 or more spaces. An existing structure is expanded by 10% or more of the building footprint and has or requires a parking lot with 40 or more spaces. Or a property changes from one use category to another and has or requires a parking lot with 40 or more spaces. Or a standalone parking lot is constructed having 40 or more spaces without an accompanying new or expanded structure. So we try to limit when we're applying the parking lot landscaping requirements because these seem to be fairly onerous. We spent a lot of time talking to the administration on this front, and so Eric, this might be an area where you want to jump in at some point. But I think we were looking at how are these really used? What do the parking lots look like in Wasilla as it stands? What are the snow removal requirements of these parking lots? When do we get to a place where we want to be telling them to include lanes and trees and center aisles and that is sort of how we came about. That's where we got our parking provisions. It was really just based on what is actually necessary and what has been an impediment.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so moving on.
You did a great job.
When applicable, an area equal to at least 5% of the parking lot must be devoted to landscaping. So currently, Title 16 requires 15% of the parking lot to be landscaped for a lot with 40 or more vehicles and requires landscaping for parking with 0 to 4 parking spaces. So we eliminated that for those smaller parking areas, and we had dropped the landscaping requirement to 15%. And this was, we spent a lot of time looking at maps and looking at what does 15% really mean, and what do you do when you have snow removal, which that was something council brought up. It's very difficult if you have landscaped everything and you have raised beds and you have to figure out how to move snow. And that was not something our code really takes into account currently, and that's creating hardship. I mean, not a hardship. Our code is lawful and, is absolutely should be followed, but it creates maybe some difficulties, we'll say that. All right, I'm gonna pause for a second because I am moving really fast.
I just have one thing.
Yes, please.
One of the things we looked at parking was the purpose of it. There are places within the city where drainage is a really big issue, and so we worked very closely with Public Works to say, what's the purpose of this island, more than aesthetics? Is this a way that, we won't have puddles that are, because they can absorb some of the pitfalls, if you wanna call it, but the drainage is one thing we looked at, and really, life and safety as well, because there are places within the city where there are islands currently constructed within an easement that, is problematic for a fire truck to come out across the street. And so we wanna look at the fire and safety too, of where they're being placed. So that was also what we talked to Holly about. Anything else, Eric?
Yeah, I guess I'll add, parking, vehicles are all, our parking spaces are, I think they're 10 by 20 because we have big trucks and big vans in the valley. So when you talk about rules for parking with really small parcels, like right here in the downtown, it gets down in the minutia about how many you can fit, and you can't be so dictatorial that you can't make a small parcel work at all. And then if you look at the really large areas like Walmart or Fred Meyer's or Cars, they tend to have way more parking than they need, but then you see them use it for snow storage. So it's a fine tuning of, businesses are going to try to approach it so that it's accessible for their customers. But if you don't allow the flexibility for nuances within properties, then you see things not get developed. You see parcels that are just undevelopable, and I think that's why you see some of these smaller parcels really just not move for decades, because they couldn't meet the more strict codes. And so we're trying to be mindful of, especially winter operations, but also, knowing that like Crystal said, runoff and management of the stormwater is really important.
So a couple of questions I have. So is there anything in the code, and I didn't see it, that prohibits snow storage within 75 feet of the high water mark?
I don't think so.
Should we have something? And we're already talking about you have to have landscaping there, and you can't disturb native growth there, and snow storage typically creates a lot of oily storage, dirty
Yeah.
water in the spring. I mean, would that be something that would be in here? Would that be?
Yeah, I think generally we can do that. We can definitely put that in. I think the reason why we don't see it is most people, if they have waterfront property, they don't generally put we don't run into a problem with them storing snow up against the property because they're trying to preserve use of that area, or they've built in a way that doesn't generally lead to snow storage right on the waterfront. But I don't see any reason why they couldn't, and so it wouldn't hurt simply to put that in the provision that involves the no clear cutting, because we can add in there, we're very specific as to just using it for access, so we can just add something that says, no. I mean, we'll have to, I think it's like a no storage provision that you're looking for. It's not just snow, but it might be, we don't want them having mounds of gravel there either, arguably, so, we
I'd
can work on
appreciate
that.
seeing something on it. And then, as far as landscaping and parking, so from 0 to 4, there's no landscaping plan or requirement for that. So if the building code requires, if our code requires 4 or less parking spaces, we don't do that. What if somebody wants to, have additional parking spaces? What if they want to have 6 or 8 where only 4 are required? Then is something going to kick in here that would, it could be to the property owner's benefit to have storage, for a trailer, for instance, that gets delivered and might be there for a couple of weeks. So he puts in additional parking to accommodate that. But if they go, well, if you bring in that additional parking, then you've got to go from 5% to 15% or whatever, that would be an issue. And then also for Eric, you talked about 10 by 20 on a parking space. Most parking spaces down south or 8 by 18. I agree with the 10 by 20, but should there be some provision that compact car parking spots could be smaller? You see that everywhere when you travel around. You see compact car parking. Not everybody, drives a truck.
No, I agree that not everyone drives a truck. I think the question would then be, would you want to have a limit on the ratio, or would you allow a building to have only compact parking? So that'd be a question. I think it makes sense if you wanted to have that nuance, but.
I think it's just a question worth looking at. Thank you.
Councilmember Graham, I agree. If you want to regulate those parking lots and require landscaping for those parking lots, that is something council, certainly can do. And so when we revised the code, and part of it was to look at when landscaping requirements for a parking lot really kicked in, and from what we were seeing on the actual use, and that was what we saw. It's when you get to a 40-car parking lot. Otherwise, you may have, you're looking at maintenance of property, and you're looking at the typical landscaping requirements for a lot that will impact the vegetation, buffers, and all of those things. But we didn't extend it to parking landscaping. So I guess that is one area we should probably, as we come across some of those questions where policy-wise the council may say, no, we really want to see that. I'll defer to you, Mayor, but maybe what we can do is sort of get an idea, kind of go around the table, see what people think. If people want us to explore that, then we can bring back a provision when we have the ordinance. We can bring forward a provision that expands this into the, a smaller. So I guess the questions would be, are you okay with just regulating landscaping of parking with the 40 plus? Or do you want to see something at a smaller level? And if you want to see something at a smaller level, we should talk numbers. So how about we ask the first question? Okay.
I'll go ahead and answer that first since I brought it up. I wasn't suggesting that we needed landscaping there, but you mentioned the 4 spots. So I was just saying, like for instance, the neighborhood where I live in, there's 52 units arranged in 4 plexes. And those are all owner occupied, particularly owner occupied units. So there is no parking requirement per se for that because they're individual units. But even though when the property was developed, there was obviously some foresight that said, hey, there might be some RVs and trailers and you might have people over. So we have an overabundance of parking in our neighborhood. However, had there been some sort of landscaping requirement that said, well, if you have more than 4 parking spaces per X many acres or X percentage of an acre, then you'd have to landscape, and I don't think that parking would have been made available. Not parking is used for snow storage, it's used for visitors, it's used for, longer term parking sort of thing. So I'm not suggesting that we add more, I'm just saying that we should, I just didn't see specificity in here between that 4 and 40.
Yeah, I think it is. I think I may have misspoke because I probably put 4 in my PowerPoint. I think I was trying to make the distinction 40. So I think that might be what happened. Madam Mayor, if I may.
Holly, I just have a question for you, if you can clarify for me. Under the landscaping standards where you said for every 100 linear feet of frontage along a right-of-way or portion of a right-of-way, at least 1 tree meeting the general standards must be retained and planted in the front yard. Is that pertaining to commercial or commercial and residential?
For the,
It was on page 17,
Okay.
the bottom one there.
So it's on page 13, did you say?
Oh, 17 of your
Okay.
handout.
All right. let me
I
look at
just
it.
want to clarify if that is, I want to make sure that doesn't apply necessarily to residential, or does it?
No, so the residential provision is just 15 to 20%, I believe, but let me pull it up to make sure that I'm not mistaken, So, I mean, for the residential, we added that 15%, and we sort of added the, which was based on our review of the aerial footage.
Right.
The,
And go down to the last
so
point on
the-
that page there, for every 100 lineal feet.
So those, let's see. Oh, no, that is a residential requirement.
Okay, then my
So-
question, if that's residential, is front yard always defined as the portion of the lot that faces a right-of-way or a street?
So the front yard, we should go to the definition of front yard, just to be sure. Their front yard is, I'm sorry, I haven't memorized all of these definitions, and
I
I
don't
will
know why
someday. Someday.
Yeah, right after we memorize them all.
Oh, I think it's gonna be under yard. I guess the real test is gonna be. You know what, it's not in definition, I'm trying to remember, I think this is where, we have a provision in this in this version, or in this proposed code, where we leave it up to the property owner to identify what is their front yard, what is their side yard, right? They can pick which one that will be.
Okay.
So it's not actually a definition, but I have to find that provision, which might take me a
Okay,
minute.
yep, and the reason
But-
I asked is that I know it seems like in most subdivisions, the front yard is what faces the street. But I'll tell you, every owner of waterfront property, their front yard is what faces the water. And so if there is a specific, requirement, I just wanted to get some definition on that.
So if a person, let's say that, and I will find the provision and send it to you because I think it's in our dimensional standards requirements, so
Okay.
but, and I don't wanna get too.
Well, and I don't mean to get
away
too
from you,
nitpicky, but I wanted to get a little bit of
So-
clarification on that, because
So-
there are differences.
So if our code, we have the definition of, we let them select their front yard, which is gonna be on a right of way or an easement. They are not going to be able to violate another provision of the code by relying on a permissive section of another code. So that's not gonna allow them to, right? So if they have a requirement that their front yard has a tree within the 100 lineal feet, and they can't have a tree, they can only use that for access, their front yard is going to be the other part of the other yard that fronts a right of way.
Okay, I'm just trying to be.
No, it's
Yeah,
good.
Maybe
It's
you can help
good.
me out here too.
Yes, no, and I will
Because
go
I
back
have
and,
a street behind me, and I have the water in front of me,
yeah.
but my front yard is what faces the water.
Right, so in our world, front yard is going to be the right of way that you access it from, and it has to do with your addressing, it has to do with, the relationship that you have with the right of way that got you to that property, so. Yeah, so the buildings will be addressed off the street and the main front entrance faces with the following exceptions, and the only exceptions that Holly was talking about is if you're on the corner, you get to pick
Yeah,
which one is the front.
Right, and I
then
can
you
see
need to
that on
stick
the
to
corner.
that. And so usually, until you say, this is where my driveway's gonna be, we won't give you an address. And so, but that corner lots are gonna have a little bit more pressure in this code to have enough trees. So if you've got 300 feet of perimeter property, you're gonna need to have 3 trees on your property. You wouldn't get any credit for trees on the other side of your house. In your example, if you had no trees between you and the road, but you had all the trees between you and the water, that wouldn't meet the code, because the front is the road in this code's mind.
Okay, thank you. I do have trees between me and the road, so.
Although it doesn't always have to be that way, as long as, you may someday have a lake turned into a public thoroughfare, which is, it's the definition of right of way in your code.
No marine highway on the lake. Thank you.
We're not in Venice, Italy, I guess.
So, Madam Mayor, I think that definition that you're looking for, lot line front means, and it's on page 16. I think that's what we're looking at. That defines the rear, the side, the front.
And then, is it in that section, here, that has the sort of you may choose if you're on a corner lot, so I'll send council that provision as well, just, once I locate it, I know that it's in here somewhere, so.
16, page 16, lot line front.
And then,
16 right here, lot line front.
oh, what was I looking at, yard, okay, yeah.
I know the book.
There's 3
Good.
different.
Yeah.
You think I don't?
But I don't know that we have a definition for front yard, which makes sense, that we would define the lot line, yeah. Here it is, so for lots situated on the intersection of 2 or more streets, the developer may make an initial determination as to which property line is the front. Egress to the property must be made from this designated front lot line. The designation of the front lot line may not be subsequently changed except with approval for the city planner. So we give that discretion, but once you make the call, you make the call. Thank you.
Here to help.
Okay, any other questions? These are tough ones. All right. See, Okay, so we're on non-conforming. And so there's a few, there's a very basic concept with non-conforming lots, buildings, and uses, which is we are grandfathering in uses, lots, and buildings under this code, and that's clear. We've separated this out. We made sure that there was a separate chapter on non-conforming lots, building, and uses, because people have this question, and they're gonna have it more, they're gonna have it even more now that we are, we're throwing a substantial rewrite at them, right? So there's gonna be a lot of people relying on these provisions. This chapter, so one of the things we may wanna do, there's some, Councilmember Cottle, for example, has some suggestions that she made regarding when, if you have a destroyed building, do you really just lose the opportunity to rebuild it in its own footprint when you're on a lot that actually precludes you from actually rebuilding or forecloses you from doing that? Is that the consequence that council wants to see happen? Or do you want to allow for a building that's destroyed to be rebuilt within the same footprint? And so that would not allow for expansion, and it would not allow for, and this is obviously presuming that they can't come into compliance with the code, right? So if you have a building, it's destroyed, they cannot come into compliance with the code and maintain and build a house of that specific size or nature. Is it reasonable to expand the allowance there and allow them to rebuild within the same footprint of the code? And so we have some language that Councilmember Cottle worked on that I think is good language, and we would put that back in if I sort of get a feel that council would like to see something like that in the ordinance, a little bit more expansive or permissive.
Madam Mayor. So Holly, on that, I don't know what that says, what Councilman Cottle did, but using the footprint, but they could build up off of that. Like there's not we're not regulating on that they can go bigger, higher in the sense, right? I mean, as long as they're using the footprint.
I think they would be subject to the same requirements. So if they're building, exactly, we're allowing them to rebuild. So if they have a property and they could not possibly rebuild a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and that's what they had and it was destroyed without violating code, under the way the proposal is written right now, the proposed code is written right now, if more than 50% of the structure is destroyed, they have to follow the current code. So this would allow them to stay within the same footprint and build the same structure. It would not allow them to violate any other provisions that would apply. We don't regulate that. I mean, I don't know that you get a residential building, for example, right? We're regulating use in Wasilla. We're not really regulating those other provisions except for as they impact water and sewer, and some sort of basic fire provisions are also there. But so we are not going to regulate. It could technically be very high, but
Right, so
I'm a
they
little
could,
nervous. Okay.
they lose a 2-bedroom, 1-story, whatever. They could build a 2-story, 5-bedroom, as long as it's on the same footprint, right?
Yes,
Thank you.
correct. So now it's all around. Okay, so I
Thank you.
see.
Too many older structures.
Councilmember Cottle, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I appreciate that clarification, because anytime I've tried to get a clarification, whether or not, like if my house burned, because I can't bring it into compliance by moving the footprint, as long as I built on the same foundation, same footprint, could I take my 1-story to a 2-story building? And I'd never gotten a definitive answer on that. So you made my day. Thank you.
And with that exception or new rule or whatever, the new building, if the old building did not meet the current setback requirements, is there a provision there that says you can't rebuild unless you meet the setback requirements? Because I know a lot of the lakefront homes were originally built as cabins on very skinny lots where the surveying technique was meets and bounds as you go from this rock over here to this tree over here. And today, that tree may not exist or that rock may be underwater. And there's all sorts of setback issues along the lake. So is there gonna be something in here that talks about, you know, if a home is destroyed and it can't be rebuilt without coming into the new setback requirements, it can't be, you know,
Yeah, no, that's
something I think we have to look at. I don't know the answer, but.
That's exactly, Councilmember Cottle,
That's
that's
the
exactly the
exception
point.
that I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I had some correspondence back and forth with Holly about that, because like my house, I could not bring it into compliance because of the road right behind me. I would be in the setback for the road, so I legally couldn't be in compliance. So I've been working on an exception for that, but then Holly also suggested that we address all non-conforming buildings that because of setbacks like that cannot come into compliance, not just waterfront. So that's something that when I say the other day, I was at planning, trying to get some information on years that codes were put in place for other non-conforming structures. And so that's something that I'm working on right now.
Great, thank you.
And so this provision also allows for the repairs, replacement, maintenance. It attempts to lay out very clearly what you can do, whether you're talking about expanding or developing, or you're talking about repairing or rebuilding. The ultimate goal is to not make this that easy. We don't want to have properties expanded or developed substantially. We don't want the life of the structure to be extended so that we have these continued violations. We want our code to come back into compliance. But another question that came up from Councilmember Cottle's email was, well, what about roof replacement? You know, and so my interpretation of the code is that a roof replacement is fine. It's the structure, it's the lifespan of the structure we're looking at, and not just a component such as a roof that you would replace or a water heater. We certainly don't want to discourage people from maintaining parts of their structure that are needed to maintain their safety. But it is, you know, if the structure itself is unsafe and is falling apart and dilapidated and you have to build a new one, we expect that to be done in accordance with the code, with the exception of you cannot build on your property and meet that requirement. And so usually that is a setback requirement, then you will. And so that's not in here now, just so you know. Right now, if it's a destruction of up to 50% or over 50%, then it has to come into compliance. And there's not an exception for those. So we'll add it and see what you guys think. So I think that's probably, so for non-conforming lots, where an existing lot of record has a lot width and or area smaller than the minimum required in the district in which it's located, that lot may be used in conformity with all other provisions of the development code. So this is just, for lots, it's very easy. We're just saying, you know, somehow you got a lot that's smaller, but it was in compliance. This wasn't in violation of the code. You continue to use it.
So you mentioned the word destruction. What about just deterioration of the property where less than 50% of it is usable, you know, for whatever the current zoning is?
Yep.
Because we do have a lot of old buildings that people just haven't been in for quite some time, and, you know, all of a sudden there's no real usable roof there, it's uninhabitable.
Yeah, and there will, at that point, that's really, you know, we're looking at the repair and maintenance provision. So on any non-conforming structure and on any building devoted in whole or in part to any non-conforming use, work may be done in any period of 12 months on ordinary repairs or in repair or replacement of non-bearing walls, fixtures, wiring, or plumbing to an extent not exceeding 10% of the current replacement value of the building, provided that the cubicle content of the building as it existed at the time of passage or amendment of this ordinance shall not be increased. So this is language we kept seeing over and over in other communities. I think the goal, and at first I was like, it's too specific, you know, it's too specific, but I think it actually has to be specific because you're trying to control conduct where you're going to get a real pushback. When we have property, we want to maintain it, we want to use it, and so you're going to have people looking for, how do I discontinue this use? And maybe I've left a building or a cabin alone for 15 years and I want to come back in and it's falling apart at the seams and I'm going to have to tear down all those 4 walls and I'm going to have to do this other thing, but I really don't want to have to come in to compliance with the code. So this is trying to find that I guess that sweet spot, right? Like, where is that line where we're being permissive so people are using their property and maintaining it? But if someone comes in and they're like, I gotta basically destroy this building or I need to redo all of the load-bearing walls, and we want them to follow the code. So from the earlier discussion though, one of the things I'm gonna look at is, how do we make it, like, how do we allow them, if they can show us they cannot follow the code, then how do we make sure we allow some movement there? Because if we don't allow any movement, we're just gonna have a building collapse on property. Which I think, it seems to me, and someone shake their head vigorously if I'm wrong, but it seems like council wants to see that too. Just making sure we have that room for movement. Yes, okay.
I think we do want to have some room for movement, but we want to make sure that uninhabitable structures are not part of the landscape.
Okay, and so we'll make sure, I'm gonna revisit this, balance it a bit more, and then we'll see what you guys think of where we end up. So one of the things to note, if you have a non-conforming use that's destroyed or discontinued or abandoned for over a year, then any right to non-conforming use is, it's eliminated. You have to, you're gonna have to use the property in conformance with the code if you do that. So that's one of those provisions we use to bring it into compliance, but also respect the property that's being used and lived in, and, yeah. All right, I'm gonna move on from non-conforming uses. So one thing to note though, all the bond requirements have been repealed except for some unrelated guarantees for public improvements that are addressed in subdivisions. And that's just, that's where there's more of a, I won't go into it right now, but those public improvements are part of sort of the subdivision process and platting process. So those are gone, bond requirements are gone.
So bond requirements for landscaping to be completed at a future date.
Yep, bond requirements are done. We use enforcement. We have and we'll get into that today. Our enforcement provisions are strict. They're express and they're comprehensive, but we're not, this code does not anticipate the use of bonds for land use requirements. It anticipates enforcement for that use. Not anticipates, regulates. Requires, I should say, if it's adopted. Yeah. So interplay with the comprehensive plan. I'm not going to go into this very much. It would take a long time. You have a very comprehensive plan. But if you look at page 21, it gives you a list of what we are looking at: the comp plan, the land development code, and the planning authority delegated by the borough. Those are our sources of law when we're regulating under Title 16. And so the current goals of the comp plan are laid out here. And I know we've spent a lot of time we've gone through those even in our earlier segments. But it's just nice to have it in one place. And then the goals specific to the downtown element are there as well. And one of the things, when we get to the ordinance, if council decides that we're ready to sort of embrace introduction, you know, we really want to pay attention to the downtown overlay district.
If I could say, I know it talks about the current goals of the comprehensive plan, and of course, we're gonna be working on an updated comprehensive plan after, more than almost 15 years here, but talks about, on bullet number 1 there, provide a balanced land use patterns that support the community's future growth. I think there should be something in there about, supporting the historical values or the historical features of the city as well, as opposed to just being growth oriented. I think we should mention that we're not just growth oriented. We are who we are, and we recognize who we were, and where it's possible, we want to preserve that.
And I think, make note. And I do think going through this process right before your comp plan is gonna make, I believe it's gonna make council much more informed as you engaged in that comp plan, and same for the commission, because you are getting into the nitty gritty of how you regulate your land use. And so that overarching comp plan goals and objectives is gonna be really fun, because you have such a handle on what's happening. And I know that's true for people who, members who have sat on the planning commission, but now as a body, I think it'll be fun to watch you guys show your stuff on all of these larger policy issues. Okay, we have finished.
Her idea of fun.
This. So does anybody need a break at all? We finished 3, we had finished 4, we're moving into 5 and 6.
Anybody need a break?
Just a quick break.
We will take a 5-minute recess.
Okay, so one thing I did want to go back to just briefly is we were talking about landscaping, and we talked about how I referred to native vegetation, but I was not specific. And Councilmember Graham had what I think is a good idea, which is to define evergreen so that we're clear what constitutes an evergreen tree. But currently under the code, I believe our only reference to evergreen, or where we are, is just to the height that's required of an evergreen tree. So we can add a definition so we're sure what tree we're talking about, but on page 107, we have the evergreen tree height requirement, which is a minimum of 6 feet. And so this particular provision, I believe these basic general standards, these came from Saldana primarily. We sort of mirrored a lot of their standards on the trees because we found that they had the same trees, or something, similar vegetation. So we can define evergreen, if that's something that council wants to see.
How about if we just do away with evergreen height requirement and just call it tree height requirement? Trees, if required, will be a minimum of 6 feet in height.
I think the purpose of having the evergreen tree hit that height, but not necessarily having it for other trees, was because other trees, so I don't know, but I think evergreens, we talked about this, and they grow slowly, so you put them in there, and so it takes time to get height and coverage, where some of the other trees grow quicker. Is that correct? That's what I remember being told. Again, not an arborist, but but we can look at just saying tree height requirement and using the 6 feet. And one thing I would say is I wouldn't want to. Let me just make sure. I don't know I don't know that much about trees, so I would like to talk to somebody, and make sure, I don't know, Eric, if you know, but otherwise I just wanna consult and, make sure that there's not some reason that we're not doing something that has an impact.
I don't know what the right answer is, but the way the code has it right now is deciduous trees are controlled by their caliper, how wide they have to be, and I think it's 1.5 inches is the minimum they have to be. And then evergreen trees have to be at least 6 feet tall. So that's a drastic reduction in how specific the current code is. But it was to say, in certain areas, you're gonna have to have both, and the minimum size for a evergreen is at least 6 feet tall, and the minimum diameter of the trunk at chest height, or whatever the caliper wording is 1.5 inches, so that we start with a reasonable size tree that, you know, it's possible to get, but you've kind of jump-started it with typically either on-site planting that you don't take down or from a nursery.
Why should we define what kind of a tree you have to use?
That's where the council needs to decide what they want for landscaping, right? So that kind of jumpstart of a new development, what does it need to look like before it really matures?
Yeah, we can, the great thing is council can eliminate any need for trees. You know, I mean, this is maintaining what we sort of saw as a minimum landscaping approach in a lot of Alaska communities, but there's no requirement that you have any landscaping, you know? It's up to the council where you wanna take your landscaping provisions.
Holly, so remind me where the 6 foot came from? Did we say it was in our previous code already, or Eric, did you say that?
No, our provisions came from Soldotna, at least for our general standards. And I do not remember how it compared to our old code, which not only, I mean, because our old code, or sorry, our current code lays out not just the type of tree, but that, and the height of the tree. We look at I mean, we can look at it together, and you can see what, because it's 30 pages of, you know, requirements
Excellent.
regarding the height.
Most of the reason why
span.
I ask is, I mean, I made a few calls to some people around the 6 foot height, and from what I discovered was 6 feet was pretty high to find a tree for here in Alaska. 4 feet was a little bit more of a normal, or 3 foot. But just 6, I mean, that's a pretty big tree, especially when you factor in shipping to get trees up to Alaska. Now, again, maybe I'm just not the expert and I don't know where to find these trees. And not just trees, shrubs was also at one in here, there was a requirement for 6 feet on shrubs as well. And I called some people that were in the midst of landscaping, and they were pretty surprised by that amount as well. So just something to think about. I mean, again, if you simple Google search and look on some websites to see what type of trees they sell. I mean, what is the average person looking for is what I did there, and 6 feet was not even an option for some websites to sell at that height.
So we could reduce it, or we could eliminate it.
Madam Mayor, I have a question. Eric, we landscaped right here in front of the city, whatever, to the back of the city. Do we put trees there?
No, there's just shrubs.
And then at Richmond Hills, there's trees there.
There are street trees.
What are the
there.
height of those trees?
You know, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because those are the ones that are locally bought. And I think we actually, if you think about it, up there where we did the extra parking up the street there, there's trees there too. And so I think they even had trouble landscaping it without getting the height of what our code says. So
Yep.
I think putting a regulation on that, agreeing with Ian that we don't even have trees like that. I mean, when I planted my maple trees, I think they were like 3 or 4 feet tall. And now they're way taller, but they're still only 1.5 inches wide, you know what I mean? So I think regulating that is gonna be tough. And I don't think anyone really wants that job. And so I think our code needs to be minimum on that, with telling them what they can. You know, you could do a mountain ash, you could do a maple tree, you could do a fern, you could, you know what I mean? Like, that should be up to the owner of the property, for sure.
So just say tree?
I would
Just say
probably say
tree.
tree.
We don't
is-
have to, I mean, it sounds like that's a good place to start. And if we find that by saying tree, we have misstepped colossally in the city of Wasilla, and there is this deep-seated need to, council can revisit it and identify what type of tree and the specific height of the tree. I mean, that's one way we can go. I mean, I think one of the things council's done with this code revision is try to back it out as far as you can with the understanding that you can then amend and fill, and it's a fluid document. So I am okay with that. But the question would be for the administration, because obviously we have established that I do not know trees, so I don't.
Well, one thing, when you're looking at planting trees, will depend on the size of your lot. There's a lot of variables that goes into, because when I had my trees planted, I called Ken and said, come over here and plant me some trees, I want a snow fence. I have no idea what kind of trees I got, I just want a snow fence. And we planted them, okay, I'm good.
Okay.
Madam Mayor.
Jared?
I mean, the only thing I would probably add to that is that as long as it's trees that are gonna survive in Alaska, I mean, I feel like that shouldn't have to be said, but I know sometimes we're gonna get people that are here or that aren't native to Alaska and might not understand that. The only other thing, I might add a minimum height of like 2 feet or 3 feet or something, just so people aren't putting a little tiny sapling that's gonna take 5 or 10 years to cover up what it's intended to cover. So I mean, I think the 6 feet is high. I think like 2 or 3 feet is probably a little bit more reasonable. So you're not buying a brand new tree, but you're not buying one that's near impossible to find. Obviously, it sounds like we've had some difficulty finding 6 foot tall trees.
So
Just remember, go ahead.
So just quick update. So the current code says that evergreen trees must be a minimum of 6 feet in height at the time of planting, and then talks about the ratio of spread. I think it's very, geometrical. So just for that background, and then we also say that citrus trees have to be 8 feet tall, or have a 2-inch minimum caliper. And the other thing I'll just bring up is, so the council has clarity on this. So Trees USA, the Arbor Day Foundation, we've been a Tree USA city for a long time. They've updated their requirements, and so they are now demanding that any qualifying city to remain qualified as Tree USA has to have very specific tree code. And so that's just something to keep in mind. If that's something that council members are interested in, I can bring more information, but it will speak in the opposite direction of reducing code requirements and be more strict to continue to be recognized by that. So I'd be happy to bring more information at a later date if that's something that interests you. But we were told this last year, your code doesn't meet our requirements, either fix it or you can't be a Tree USA. So.
Madam Mayor, I would just soon not be a tree city then.
I was gonna say,
I
I
don't.
agree with that too, because
You
what
know,
is the benefit of being
The places that put these things
It's
together,
Alaska.
there are things for like tree cities and stuff, they're not in Alaska. They have no clue what we have to deal with to get us, even to get a 6-foot tree. I want that height requirement drastically lowered. I don't want to tell people what kind of tree to plant. If I had my way, there would not be a single birch tree in the state because I'm allergic to them. If I had my way, I'd cut down I'd clear cut birch trees on my lot, but that's not an option. Same with cottonwood, no way, they could just all go away. But I want people to have the option of what they want to plant in their yards. There's beautiful ornamental trees that people grow here in Alaska. Yeah, we know that the chokecherry, which I love chokecherry trees, but we know that, they're not good for the moose. I think people as landowners should have some options and not be so restricted. And yeah, if being a Tree USA city makes things more stringent, I'd say kick that one to the curb.
Madam Mayor.
Guess we're getting big money or something, but.
Right, that's what I'm saying, there's no kickback for us on that, no, I agree. One thing we could do too is, just like Ian said, he did a little research, but Jacobson Greenhouse, Ken's, we can call a few of these and see what their average height of their trees that they're getting in, right? Because we obviously want people to shop locally, and so it would benefit us to be like, these are our greenhouses around town that are bringing in 3-foot tall trees, and so that maybe should be what our minimum requirement is.
And they're ordering those trees now so they can get them in the spring, so they can be grown, you know, so they can get them in the spring, so it makes sense to do that. And I think if there are restrictions on trees, or any sort of plantings, there should be some sort of reference to the state of Alaska invasive species definition. You know, if the state identifies it as an invasive species, it's not allowed, you know, to be planted in the city. So that way we're not trying to keep track of choke cherries and so on and so forth. But if the state identifies it, then greenhouses would be aware of that and they wouldn't sell it.
I mean, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's best for us just to step back and remove, I mean, maybe we don't, I mean, we can require trees, and that's really, and most of this applies, you know, when you get your landscaping plan, then you're going, and that's what commercial and for residential units, right? So multifamily with 4 units, you're going to have them complying with these provisions. One thing we can do is we can narrow it. We apply the provisions to residential property only to the extent they are applicable, but really we just want the residential properties to avoid clear cutting their property, that maintain that 15-20%. So I can go in and make sure we dial that back and protect the residential dwellings from anything other than the general provision, and then go in and do what evergreen trees? Do I just so from what I'm hearing is we could either just eliminate any references to those trees as far as their height, and if to where we have a number of trees specified, we'll retain that and just eliminate any reference to type. Would that get to where everybody is going, or is that too, or do you want to eliminate?
I think the word
further.
evergreen needs to be removed. I think that's been the general consensus. I mean, again, I
Okay.
feel like what Mr. Graham said is we need trees. If we are gonna add something about what type of trees, it just needs to basically say, like, I don't know how you'd word it, but trees that are gonna grow in Alaska and that are gonna actually last. Height requirement, I don't know. I feel like I'd like to call Jacobson's or something and just say, hey, what's the average height of a tree that you sell to a commercial customer that's looking to put in trees? And if they say it's 3 feet, great, we'll say 3 feet. If it's 2 feet, great, we'll say 2 feet. But I feel like that answer, and that could probably be done as a more of a policy thing when we're making amendments to the final code at this point. We just need to earmark it to come back to it later
Okay.
as to what that final one will be. That's my thought.
No distinction between evergreen and deciduous, average height, and then I think the one issue we might have to deal with, but we'll bring this back, we can work this out, but is just how to distinguish. If we're going to just reduce the height and the distinction between the 2 types of trees, then we might want to look at the caliper, which is, you know, I believe it was 2 before, now it's 1.5 as a requirement in our code. So we're putting that all together in a provision that's less restrictive, but makes sense. And we'll call, will you help me call?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we are done with landscaping unless anybody else has something they want to delve into. And we have solved the evergreen conundrum, Councilmember Graham. So it's a wonderful note to move forward on. All right, so Sarah, can you pull up the PowerPoint for Division 5 and 6? So while Sarah's working on that, we're gonna move you where, this is gonna be very impressive actually, and the reason why is the Division 5 and 6 those divisions in the code actually deal with the parts of the code that we have spent the most amount of time on. So when we first started talking about a Title 16 rewrite, one of the drivers, the main drivers, was the permitting system that the city had adopted. And that system involved an administrative permitting procedure, administrative approval, administrative approval, use permit, a potential elevation of the permit, and the conditional use permit, right? And enforcement procedures. Now, even though if you looked at your code, and I'm talking outside the PowerPoint right now, just so if anyone feels lost, it's not, I haven't delved into the PowerPoint because I think I'm going to talk to you about a few of these overarching issues and then we'll move through the PowerPoint. I'm guessing much quicker. And we'll skip some sections in the PowerPoint if we need to. But the biggest problem that we were running into, and if you can remember, it was that there were conditional use permit criteria in your code, or there are in your code right now, and there are more than 20 criteria that are applied to a conditional use permit, that evaluation. So your planning commission is walking through each one of those criteria with each conditional use permit. A lot of that criteria involves things like the fit of the neighborhood, or the harmony with the appearance of of your neighbors. And so there's all of these provisions that are very discretionary, whether or not you are meeting those standards or the property meets those standards, very discretionary. Completely appropriate for a conditional use permit, right? A conditional use permit process generally involves a body appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the council that looks at these discretionary concepts that are important under your comprehensive plan and applies them and allows the public to come and engage and talk about those things and sends out notices to neighbors so they can be there too. And everybody walks through and sort of slogs through these difficult, often emotional, sometimes controversial land use. Wasilla applied that process to every stage of permitting and every stage of use. So from the administrative approval stage, the planner was required to apply those same criteria. And so that puts the planner in a very difficult position. So they have to apply that and apply all of that discretion, make a decision. A use permit was the same thing. The only difference was it required notice to adjacent property owners. And once again, put the planner in the position to apply that discretion. If the planner felt uncomfortable applying that discretion or couldn't figure out exactly how to apply it responsibly, because there's so many provisions and there's a ton of criteria, then they might elevate that permit and bring it to the planning commission. The planning commission would then decide that permit applying the conditional use permit criteria. So the problem that this created was that nobody buying property in the city of Wasilla could possibly understand exactly what level of scrutiny their property and their use of their property was going to be put to. That is lawful. There is nothing wrong with Wasilla's code as it is written and it applies. I want to make sure I'm making that clear, but that obviously was a huge hindrance. So what we did, and I'm just going to break it down in the larger concepts because we spent so much time on this, and I don't think this one is sort of that squarely legal arena. So I don't know how much, I don't know how much council wants to delve into the details, but basically we separated it out. We eliminated we kept the administrative approval process. We apply the administrative approval process with specific criteria for a use. So you're checking off what is required. And we move into, that limits the planner's discretion. It's not asking, is this a good fit for this neighborhood? It's asking, did you give me a permit for your wastewater, and water treatment? Did you meet the setbacks of the requirements. Is this a permitted use in this district? It's asking those questions, which are not discretionary, you know, and so we eliminated the right to elevate, and we turned things that had some component of controversy, or as we walked through with council and the commission, we looked at those things that maybe needed more, and we put those under conditional use permits. So even though, so the commission is going, so it'll be interesting to see their comments, they're going to be getting more permits before them as a conditional use permit, because they are the body that appropriately applies that criteria. The conditional use permit criteria was changed and streamlined with what we see throughout the state, which makes it, and therefore reflects sort of what we see in the cases, where these cases find their way before the Superior Court or the Alaska Supreme Court. We want to see that similar criteria so we can follow it and we can make sure we're making uniform decisions, you know, to the extent that makes sense. So that is what happened with permitting. And the conditional use permit was preserved. That process is the same, so it will be clean line. So when someone buys property in the city of Wasilla now, they will go to their district use chart, they will see, oh, I need a conditional use permit for that. And they will be able to start that application process and understand that there's a lot of discretion here. I'm not sure I'm gonna get it. And when they go to the administrative and they see AA, you know, and they know that that's, you know, permitted, they're gonna be able to say to themselves, I can gather all of these things and I will be able to do and get this permit. And I don't have to question, no, nothing's gonna come between me and this permit. And the notice requirements reflect that administrative piece where council's really just checking off through the planner, you know, do we know how our property's being used? And are they aware of our code and the requirements? So that said, I'm going to pause. Does anybody have any questions about that basic structure? Does anybody want to spend time revisiting the criteria specifically, or do you feel comfortable with this particular piece? Okay. So now I'm going to take a second because I think I really covered Division 5, and I know it looks like I'm just trying to beat the clock, but I swear I am not. This really has been the one that we have been talking about because it's kind of spurred, this combined with the landscaping plan is sort of how we ended up here, but I do think sometimes the PowerPoint is helpful just to have it because it identifies the chapters, it breaks the main objectives out, and gives you specific sites and helps you navigate those provisions. One thing I will point out, no administrative permit is needed. I want to get to this page. Did I go the wrong way? Okay, let me just get to this because this is interesting and your constituents may have questions about this. So it's good to discuss them and make sure everybody is okay with this. So no administrative permit is required for any change to an existing building that does not increase the height or exterior dimension of any floor of the building. We're just not going to make them get a permit unless council decides otherwise, but that's how it's proposed. The construction, erection, or modification of a building or a structure under 250 square feet. So for this provision, we talked a lot about what size building starts to put a burden on infrastructure, right? When is a structure going to potentially have, or do we expect it to have water and potentially sewer, or, you know, and put a burden on property? Erection or construction of a communication tower with a height not exceeding 35 feet or an amateur radio tower. Fences unless otherwise regulated by the code. So we do have some fences regulated for buffers and parking. You know, there's some regulations that happen in there, but otherwise you don't need a permit to put up a fence.
On bullet 3 there, communication tower, you know, in Anchorage now you're starting to see, what do they call it? Level 5, what is that crap? 5G, well, it's all nonsense to me, but I mean, you're now seeing 5G towers, which aren't really towers. So Anchorage has some regulations about where they can be, and those were specifically approved by the Anchorage Assembly there. But I mean, when we talk about a tower here, are we talking about a tower with a single antenna? Are we talking about, will we allow 3 or 4 antennas so it looks like one of these cluster antennas like we have now? Is that something we should think about or talk about?
Stu, if I might just jump in here, I think the word there is amateur radio. So,
It says or, amateur radio tower.
yeah,
Communication tower with a height not exceeding 35 feet, or an amateur
I
radio.
missed the or, I'm sorry.
We can do some research and bring it back, and you guys can consider taking this one off and putting it in the, and regulating it. So one of the reasons why you find the exemption for administrative permits is the restrictions under federal law on what can be considered in the permitting process when you're talking about a communication tower. So it's easier if, with the 35-foot restriction, to avoid the permitting process if you can, arguably, if we're aiming for less regulation. But that said, we can definitely bring it back. A lot of communities do, and if we add it to an administrative permit, the only thing that I would want to do is have a separate section on it, because, so there are things like health and all of these considerations that often the public will bring into, I don't want a tower there, that we just are not allowed to consider. So it's just sort of a hot, but it's sort of a hot topic. It's one of those things where it becomes, we're very vulnerable to violation of federal law if we are heavily permitting. So, but what I can do is I could bring those provisions and we could talk about, do we want to at least require a conditional use permit over a certain height, or if they're coupling on a tower. Sounds like that might be, I don't know. Does council want to consider that?
Eric, at what height does FAA get involved?
I'm not an expert on that, but what I understood today was like, I think it's 125 feet.
Was that what it was?
Yeah, that's what they were saying today at our meeting.
Well, my concern is just that we don't end up with these 35-foot towers with clusters of antennas on them. Like, for instance, you look at cell phone towers now, and even emergency services communication towers, there are, a variety of antennas on them at different levels, and then at the top, there's this mushroom of different antennas. Some of these towers have 10 or 12 antennas at the very top, and it's not conducive with something, in the middle of the city where it's not, there's nothing that says you can't put that in an R1 area, and then there's nothing here that says that. So I just, true, the communications people would much rather have the 50 or 100-foot towers, depending on what the borough offers. But in the case of Anchorage, you drive around subdivisions now and you can see those 5G towers if you know what you're looking at, and you'll go, what the, and that's right at, second floor window height in a, fairly nice residential neighborhood. I mean, as long as there's just that one there, it doesn't look bad, but there's, there's nothing that says if we don't restrict it to one, that there couldn't be a cluster there. And I just don't think that's very attractive at the present moment. I don't think it's appropriate. At some point, we'll want to have 5G all the way through the city, which means we'll have some of those individual towers in different places. But I don't think we want, Kathy's place to turn into an antenna farm.
You wouldn't have.
Well, and I do think we have limitations on where you can have them in our city. They're pretty strict. So so we have them in, and let me go back and see, but I know we can allow, I know they're allowed in commercial. Yep, so they're allowed in commercial. And they're,
Amateur radio towers don't have that restriction, as I recall.
Well, communication equipment is how we identify it in the code, so it's going to cover, you know, all of that. But with that, it's an excellent point. I think we need to make sure our definition for communication equipment clearly covers not only the equipment that we're aware of now, but equipment that is developed in the future, when we look at the 5G, for example. So that, I think, Councilmember Graham, is what correct me if I'm wrong, but we have only certain districts that you can have these in, and that's why we have a 35-foot. They're not in residential. I think they are in multifamily. I think they are in RM, so it includes navigational aids, commercial satellite dishes, antennas over 35 feet in height, and airport approach lighting. So what we'll do is we'll expand that definition to make sure that we are comfortably including within that any new equipment and towers. We'll just make sure it's a little more comprehensive. Does that sound okay? And then the next question is, Councilmember Johnson, you might be getting to this. Are you guys okay where it's permitted? Because we won't be asking them for a permit in those permitted areas. Do you want to limit it more, or do you want to require a permit? I think my choice, if just given the legal complications, right, given the many federal laws that we have to navigate when permitting and making decisions on these, is to identify where you are okay with them being located and limit their locations.
So a cell phone tower, by its definition, is a commercial venture. That's the first thing. Second thing, in order to power this cell phone, you're actually going to need a structure, which is probably more than 250 square feet, just due to the power and the connections to and from the tower. So already within our code, we're going to be very restrictive, because you're going to have to be a commercial zoned property, okay, that would then meet the tower requirements that you were just saying. So I couldn't just put it up on an R2. I couldn't put it up on an industrial even. It'd have to be zoned commercial.
No, that's a good point. And do we want to go through and make sure, because again, I remember RM and I remember commercial for towers. I remember working on those, but did we allow it in residential? Okay, so that's what we need to, so I think eliminating it from residential, and then R1, any others we might want to, or just start there, eliminate it from R1 and get a clearer definition?
And I think a clear definition of commercial needs to be done as well. If I'm running a daycare out of my house and I have Skylink or Starlink or whatever it is,
That's different.
is that now a commercial antenna because I'm using it to babysit the kids? I don't know.
It's like having DTV.
Yeah, Starlink is tiny, it's not a tower.
Starlink is just flat.
That wasn't a good example.
Right, but you need to put it up where you've got a reasonable line of sight. So most people put it on the roof, it should be fine, but.
Well, and we'll just work on this too, because maybe by distinguishing a tower and, we'll delve in more to what because we did not change, I think we may have changed the definition, maybe, but we definitely, we did not look at how we're defining communication equipment in light of the 21st century. So let's look at what's there, what's changed, and make sure. I'm guessing what's coming back to you is more than one definition. Yeah.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
So if I could add one further comment. I think the key would be for residential to allow, say, amateur radio tower, okay, because that's amateur, it's not commercial. Okay, but as soon as you open it up then to commercial, then you're into a totally different world.
That sounds good. Maybe all those ham radio operators out there will have notes they could get to the clerk, please. But we'll work on that, and I'm guessing it'll be a little more complicated in the definitions, but we won't, but not, but a clear, and that's always the goal, right? So, all right. So I think we were on We were on 5, home occupation accessory uses as provided in 1660-20. And this is really to partially encourage the use of, or the creation of housing. This was something that council and the commission had talked about. So if they're using it's an accessory use, then they're not going to have to get an administrative permit. Now remember though, if you have a short-term rental, they're going to go through that specific use criteria process, and they are going to have to go through the permit process. So this is certainly not, in some cases, right? And so that's just, it allows it to move. It's a very streamlined process. Okay, 6, removal of any building or structure unless expressly required under this title. So they are not going to be coming to planning to remove a building. They will remove the building without a permit. Now, this one we thought a lot about, but because the city doesn't regulate the building code, and it's not playing that role, the construction or the demolition really is also not within the city's role. And termination of any type of use, same difference. The addition of farm animals or beehives permitted under and in compliance with Title 16. So this is where we really see the city moving towards, hey, follow the law. And if you don't follow the law, and we notice that you don't follow the law, then we are going to enforce our laws. And we are going to make sure you understand the cost of that violation, and that we protect the city's ability to incentivize compliance. But we are trusting, in essence, for you to follow the law. Instead of permitting everything on the front end, we simply are going to enforce everything on the back end, or at least create the allowance for that. So instead of them coming to the city every time they get a new beehive, it's going to be expected that they read the code, and certainly the staff is there for questions, but you know, that is, but once we have, and this is the other thing to note, when we require something to be done by a decision, we create the need for due process, because all of these rights in the world of land development are property rights. Some more, some less, but they're property rights. And so we want to be very careful when we're creating that due process that we can actually, we have the resources to man it, that we have the laws to govern it, which you're going to. But that's one of the reasons why stepping back the code creates a sort of ripple effect of simplicity in theory. Ripple effect of simplicity. I feel like that was a good moment. So, all right, interior alterations to interior or exterior features which are not visible from an exterior public space or street. This is clearly, we do not want to be regulating or permitting what's going on inside the building to the extent we can avoid that. There are some things that require permitting when we're looking at an actual use, because at that point, we're once again looking at the burden it's putting on our infrastructure and our utilities. Routine maintenance on pre-existing structures, replacement of dead, damaged, or stolen landscaping, site furniture, paving materials, or lighting that was previously approved. So this is sort of the insult to injury provision. I mean, if you have somebody who is just replacing something that has been taken, or requiring them to go through a permitting process to get what they're trying to do is make themselves whole back in the same place, this provision keeps us from having to navigate that. Change of tenant in lawfully existing commercial building with no change in building footprint, water and sewage usage, or classification or increase in parking requirements. So this one is limited. Again, we're trying to pay attention to the burden placed and the impact. And if there is no change, then we are allowing those commercial operations. And a lot of times you'll see these in sort of the strip mall commercial buildings, which will have a lot of leasees. This allows them to move through that really seamlessly, except what if they want to turn a retail store into a restaurant with the next tenant, where we're going to see that, and that's going to change the use of all of those, the water and sewer, possibly even the parking. And so that's when the city is going to pay attention. Okay. Finally, roof or deck repair or replacement. There is going to be no, oh, I'm a little bit behind here, sorry about that, there you go. So those are no administrative permit needed. I think the one that we are gonna be looking into based on council's discussion is the tower and communications. But other than that, does anybody have any other ones they wanna flag for consideration?
Through the mayor.
So the only question that I have is regarding number 12, the change of tenant, and to some degree the home occupation one as well, but I'll focus on the change in tenant. So as it stands now, the person, how would we know?
Well, I mean, I think that's, you will see a change either to our utilities, or maybe you're staring at the, sign and it changes to a restaurant, or, so that's one way we'll know. We'll see and feel the burden, as will the neighborhood and the community. The other way is other people will feel or see the burden, someone who's adjacent to them, and so then they report the violation, at which point the city enforces it. Assuming it has the resources. The city is never forced to enforce something, at the city, but that's the concept. The same way, that's how we'll know.
So one thing that we're doing now is working really closely with our business licensing, and they have the ability to, when the person is getting their business license, we could potentially put a checklist in place similar to what we would do on the home occupation, in which they could go through and say, what is their uses, then we do a quick review, and then, no permit needed, we move them on at that point.
I think,
Or
so,
are we back to the permit?
yeah, I mean, I think you have to make a decision on a lot of these things. We still have an administrative approval process and a permitting process. And we have requirements for getting, water and sewer permitting that we are working on to make sure that when there's that change, we have that piece. You can absolutely have checklists for them, but I think the goal is to allow these, or at least council and the commission's goal originally. So when we can bend this, was to allow to deregulate. And so deregulating here, we are requiring them to meet these very specific, these specific criteria before they will be exempt from the permit. If they are not, then they're required to get a permit. So we should have a permit from everybody who is increasing their footprint or changing their.
Yeah, so what Cindy brought up is a good point, and I don't know if the council understands this, but code compliance is out there looking for code, but they're also working very closely with our sales tax department. And so that they feed information back and forth. So my concern about a strip mall having a retail place that then turns into a food restaurant that generates a bunch of grease and fats, and they don't have the infrastructure that they need, and we're not prepared for it, and I own the tank, and we see this again and again and again. We want to catch them as soon as possible, and especially in that relationship, you have a landowner and then a tenant, and the tenant doesn't really know, and the landowner's maybe a bit absentee. We don't find it till sewage is flowing out of the ground, and then we fall down this path like, do you have your business license? Oh, you really need to come talk to us, and now we need to deal with this infrastructure. And so they go back and forth with maybe business licensing notices first, and then need to tell code compliance. Code compliance notices there's a new sign up, and then says the business licensing, did you know, are they there on your radar? And so I think that what we've put together does remove a bunch of burden and kind of has an ease of entry. And then as you get more complicated and you fall outside of these, what do we call them, exemptions, then we do really need to talk to you. And then that's just the ever-present ongoing education that we have to do with the public on where our code applies and where it doesn't.
One of the things that I like to add when I'm speaking to people is I'd rather speak to them on the front end and welcome them to the city rather than having our code compliance visit them on the other side. So this would work well as well.
And we can do I think having the checklist is a brilliant idea. I think that's really great. And I also think it's completely within council's purview, and it would make sense if you want to remove, say, one of these, and that's okay too. We brought what we thought was sort of a responsible start for exemption. Because at one of our meetings, I think council was torn, I think that was a council commission meeting, but it was really torn between, we really want to step back, but we do want some, we don't want to step all the way back, you know, we want to know and make sure we're watching infrastructure impacts more than anything. I think that was, and, okay, so the other thing we do in the code, which is worth mentioning, is we are very clear that we are able to enforce this code and the provisions and the permits against more than one person, against the owner and against the tenant and against, you know, this is the property. And that is something that's always caused a little bit of consternation for the city. Just who is, if we have a commercial lease and the tenant is violating the lease, what's the responsibility of the owner? You know, and under the law, they are responsible under that permit to make sure that their land is being used in compliance with the code. But that's not, you know, making that clear is important. And that also gives the administration another conversation point, which is, you know, if you're talking to a tenant and the tenant is not quite getting where they need to get for compliance, maybe the landlord's going to be much more apt to make sure that they're doing that, especially when faced with potential violations. So the hope is their conversation gets better too, in that communication between the property owner and the lessees spurs compliance. So I am just, all right, so I think that was the only other thing. I'm just going through, a lot of this is just criteria that I think you can review on your own. And again, we're not really, we have reduced the 20+ criteria to, it's more like, I think it's about 9 criteria under conditional use permits now, but they're broader. And so they encompass all of the other things that were being considered. They really allow the commission greater latitude in considering what they want to see and whether or not that use it should be permitted in that district, which is why it's a conditional use, not an administrative approval. All right, the other thing to note, this is on page 11. I'm trying to get to this. So, under the current code, when you file an appeal, the permit is stayed and automatically, unless you can show that there's going to be some harm from staying the permit. So more than once, what we've seen is a permit has been approved and it has squarely met criteria. Then it gets appealed. The appeal stays the permit. In some cases, under your current code, and we've sort of eliminated these 1-year use permits, you know, and they're permits for use. They run with the land, so they now have more time. But I think short-term rental still has a limit. So anyway, what you would get is somebody will challenge it. They'll appeal it. The person holding the permit's behavior is stayed, and the appeal effectively wins before it starts. Because if you're a commercial business and you have just had your permitted conduct stayed, pending an appeal, that could have extensions, and that could take, you know, it takes time. And so that permit has been undermined substantially. So now what we've done is we just flipped it. When you have a permit, it's presumed that it's not stayed unless the appellant or the hearing officer, if we're looking at a hearing officer situation, or the commission finds that it would cause a harm not to stay it. So we reversed. Does anybody have any problem with that reversal? All right, so that is, so here's a comparison of the commission and hearing officer hearings. This is one thing we're looking at. I have one question for council in here, so I'm gonna pull it up. So the way that this is drafted, the commission decision is appealed to a hearing officer. It has 15 days to appeal a decision by the planning commission to a hearing officer. The notice for an appeal to the commission, to a hearing officer is given to interested parties, and it's just posted on the city website. Interested parties have, are parties that have submitted written arguments to the hearing officer, also includes the planner, the appellant, or their representatives. And they get to submit oral argument before the hearing officer. The hearings will be held within 15 days, and they have 15 minutes for, given for argument, and 5 minutes is given for rebuttal. The decision is issued within 45 days and posted on the city website. Okay, so when we compare that to what happens with an appeal to the planning commission, so remember, first layer is planning commission, second is hearing officer. Then after the hearing officer, if it's appealed, it's going to be appealed to the Superior Court. So for the planning commission, there is a notice to neighboring property owners within 1,200 feet of the site. This is a very large area. So most of the time, what I have seen in other communities is somewhere between 250 and 500 feet from the site. But Wasilla has 1,200, which increases significantly the amount of individuals that are seen as interested parties in that proceeding. So I'm not sure, I mean, I will leave it, or I can reduce it to what, I could take the 5 communities, or I could take our comparable communities and find the average of their property, or whichever one we see the most of with the most distance. I don't know. I mean, is there a way to, do you want to see what that looks like so you can maybe think and play with that number, or are you okay with 1,200? It's just, it's very generous to the potentially interested property owners, right? People on, because 1,500 feet. So it's a lot, that's far. So it's not very generous to the permit applicant. Yeah, that's a lot of people.
Usually people with the, within the 1,200 feet, they get those notices. I, for one, pitch them in the garbage. Don't even look at it. And the ones that are really interested are within the 250 to 500 feet.
Yeah, I mean, if that, what we could do, because I think this is one, if we're clear, and when we're going through the ordinance, if we draw attention to the change, we can see sort of what kind of, you know, what kind of public comment and otherwise you get, and you can look at that number and sort of weigh. So if that's, my inclination, and this is the same, and Crystal was just pointing out, it's the same for conditional use permits, that adjacent property owners always 1,200. In the new code, I've made other provisions regarding the property owner 300. And so when we're putting a notice requirement upon the city that wasn't there before, you know, that's when I use, and that's like enforcement orders, things like that. So my inclination then is to change it to 500 and then bring it back to council and just see how that feels. Okay, and we'll make sure any information materials that emphasize this change, because it is a change to public notice. Okay.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Holly, I would like to see it absolutely nothing more than 500. I think more than 500 for every notice that's gone out that I've read and read through, you know, how many they've gotten back and how many people have actually put in comments. I don't know that I can even think of one that it wasn't just right close to existing core around the property in question. I think doing anything more than 500 is a waste of city time and resources.
Okay.
Elena?
So you said the other one that you put in is 300 feet?
Yes, 500 is still a lot.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I feel like it's still a lot.
So.
So I don't know if we can push that number lower. Obviously, we have record of where the complaints are coming, and like you said, they're within 150 to 200 feet, probably most of them. So I don't know if we can take that lower, but it would make sense because the workload is heavy on whoever's having to do that.
So we'll push it to 300, because I still think you're actually, that's more than a lot of communities that are in the 250 range. I see 250 a lot. That is the one I see the most. So I think we can put 300, but before putting in a specific number, maybe we can look at, and Cindy could delve into where we're seeing the comments from. We can get an idea, and then maybe we can also pull up what 300 feet looks like from a parcel on a map. You know, because seeing it, how many lots are, you know, fall within a 300-foot radius, I think would be helpful. But I don't have those skills. Those are similar to my tree identification skills, so.
I can do it, but I think we're getting.
All right, good. Okay, so I think
I
we
would
have,
think-
we have,
Before we decide on an arbitrary number, a lot of lots in the city are 200 feet or more. And I would think, you know, if you're gonna pick a number, you would, as opposed to picking a number, you would say, you know, at least 2 lots from where you are. So not only would I need to look at Elena's lot, but I would need to look at the clerk's lot, or notify the clerk's lot as well. So that circle includes just not your immediate neighbors, but the next neighbor down the road. You know, up to a maximum of, you know, 500 feet or whatever. You know, or 300 feet I don't think is necessarily gonna include 2 property owners would be my only concern. Is that true on all? No, but it is true on some, and it is typically the, you know, the commercial property owners where you see the majority of, you know, hearings before the commission and before hearing officers. But
No,
I would
it's-
like to see at least 2 neighbors down the road and behind me and in front of me and to the other side notified.
I think that's actually a good point. Everybody uses the feet. Maybe we could be a little bit innovative and pay attention to the reality, which is, you know, what are we looking at? When we're looking at, is it different for different zoning districts, which we can identify. If it works really well in a residential district to have a square footage, because 300 feet really is gonna work, but doesn't work in a rural residential where you have the larger lots, and we could use a more sort of adjacent property plus 2 or whatever it is. We'll look at it, and then I think that's actually a good idea, you know, because you're right. If our property amount does not get us to the adjacent lot owners and the people across the street and probably one more, you know, then it's not sufficient. And maybe that is where 1,200 came from, but, so we'll look at that and then play around with it and bring something back.
The time is 8 p.m.
All right, can I have 1 minute?
1 minute.
All right.
Before we get into that 1 minute, my biggest concern here is on the commission hearings, we have taken out public comment. It says 5 minutes. You know, only person to submit written arguments to the commission before the meeting may present an oral argument. Currently, anybody that shows up can present an oral argument, and I think they're given 3 minutes to do that.
No, they can do public comment, but they're not going to give oral argument. So on if you have it in an open meeting session, if you have it, the public has a right to attend, but it doesn't have a right to speak. So it's, you know, that, and which is typical for a quasi-judicial proceeding. The public has a right. So what most communities do with their planning commission meetings is they basically put a quasi-judicial proceeding in the middle of their meetings. And those meetings are subject to the Open Meetings Act, which then allows for the public, to participate, and then they sort of merge them. And so that is something that the city needs to get better at. Yes, we're still gonna continue with the planning commission meeting with public comment, but the hearing, the quasi-judicial proceeding where you're presenting evidence and you're an aggrieved party or an interested party and you have a right to appeal up to the Superior Court, does have that limitation based on participation. So if I put in written comments to the planner, or I show up and I talk, then I can participate in the appeal, so. All right. I think you
Okay.
took my whole minute, Councilmember Graham.
No, you took your.
Then I took my whole minute. Yeah. So anyway, on the violations, I actually think it's pretty straightforward. If you just look at page 14, 15 through 17, we just very clearly specify what a violation is and when the city takes action, and we talk about enforcement proceedings and what that procedure looks like, and make sure we have an appeal procedure in there on an administrative front that takes, that allows somebody to challenge an enforcement of an order. And then we also make sure we have provisions that allow the mayor through the planner. And the reason why it says the mayor through the planner, you don't see that very often in Title 16, is because we have provisions that allow us to stop the conduct. And so that's a more significant interference. So we have provisions that allow us to fine, but it also allows the mayor to stop the conduct and stop an abatement or abate a nuisance. And so we want that to go from the mayor through the planner. So we're keeping that decision is engaging the administration as at its highest level. Sorry, I'm trying to speak as quickly as I can, then that is it, I am done. Thank you very much. And any questions?
Yeah, I just have one thing, you know, and when you're looking on this document, talk about fines and filing fees. The last thing on the second page there says, daily administrative fines for violations can be assessed for failure to comply with an enforcement order. It says may be levied by the mayor while a written enforcement order is in effect. I don't like the word may there. We're either gonna enforce them or we're not, you know, and it shouldn't be an individual decision to do that. It should be a code decision to do that.
No, that's fair, and you know what, some communities will do is they'll very specifically have like a hardship abatement or deference. So if there is, that it allows the mayor to not enforce it if certain criteria are met for a certain period of time. And that's usually where something has happened and they just can't get in front of it, and there's some reason that they're giving you, if you could just wait until Monday, I'll get this corrected.
I'd be more comfortable if that was codified.
Okay, and we do have discretion to the planner to say that enforcement is no longer, this is something missing from our code, we allow the planner to issue a corrective notice of correction, if there came into compliance and we no longer have a violation, it makes it easier to get out of the enforcement when you have someone who's complying. Because once you start this train, so to speak, it's sometimes harder to pull it back once the code enforcement officer has filed pleadings or forward. So this just makes it as easy as possible. You're in compliance. All right, Mayor. 5 minutes, not bad.
Okay, is there a motion to exit committee of the whole?
Mayor, I move we exit the community of the whole.
Is there a second?
Rubio seconds.
Okay, the motion has been made by Councilperson Velock and seconded by Councilperson Rubio to exit committee of the whole. So we are now out of committee of the whole. The next is, there's no new business, audience comment. There is no people in the audience. So bring it back to the dais, Madam Deputy Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Your next regular meeting is going to be on November 25th, a week from today. It's a pretty big agenda, so the discussion on Title 16 was removed from that agenda. If you want to think about dates on when you'd like to see the Title 16 rewrite, if you could get those back to us maybe by next Monday. You do have 5 meetings in December, so you may not want to throw in a Title 16 rewrite in December, but Ian does. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Madam Attorney.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. One thing I want to note is that we did finish Title 16 as far as our PowerPoints go and our discussions. I know we may want to talk about enforcement at some point a little bit more. Maybe. I feel like those provisions are pretty clear. So the one thing I would like council to consider when you're, and this really just dovetails into the clerk's comments, but when does council want to see, or does council want to see an ordinance, and what is the action item that takes that next step? because we have here a sort of working draft of the ordinance. And so we have a lot of comments to go through and finalize, but it's not, I mean, the bear of the project has been done, so it's just a few, so if council, has a date certain, that would be maybe at the next meeting, if council could identify a date.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Councilmember Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thanks for everybody being here and pitching in. That's great. Couple things, earlier we mentioned Tree City USA, and that kind of triggered my memory of Arbor Day when we didn't have any seedlings because either we didn't order them or whatever the case was. If we could make sure that we get those ordered now so that come Arbor Day this year, we have seedlings to pass out, because we've done that in the past. And even though it has been under a different organization, I think, paying for it, I think it would behoove the city, to invest in those seedlings to have them to give away. And whether we need to order them now or whenever, I think it would be appropriate to do that.
We've struggled because we can't get them up here in time, and the last few years the attendance has been very difficult. So I don't know if we have a solution to have a successful Arbor Day event because of how cold we are. Everyone down south has them a lot earlier than we can get the trees, and the shipping has been pretty atrocious. They don't come alive, or they come. Getting them even to tell us when they're going to come has been difficult. So I don't have high hopes that I can meet that goal with the way it's organized right now. But we definitely want to have a function that works. It's just we haven't found a winning equation the last couple of years.
Well, perhaps even at the mayor's picnic, we could have the opportunity for people to pick up seedlings.
Yeah, if we don't stick to the date that
Right.
they want us to have it, we could be more flexible for sure.
I'd like to see somebody look into that. That'd be good. Also, Alaska Municipal League, newly elected officers training is tomorrow. You don't have to be a newly elected to go. So tomorrow is day one of a 2-day training. Tomorrow is all virtual, starts at 9 o'clock in this conference room right back here. There will be, snacks and beverages for folks that want to attend. I think the 9 o'clock one talks about budgeting. We are swinging into budget cycle, and so that would certainly be a good one to attend. Unfortunately, I have another event I need to go to there, but there's discussions of a variety of different things. The clerk's office has that schedule, but I highly encourage you to stop by and spend some time, and since it's virtual, it's not as interactive as it would be one-on-one like it was for many of us when we went at the Captain Cook, but I highly encourage you to go. It's, maximum of 1 day. You don't have to go to all the sessions. You can pick and choose whichever ones you want to go to, but please take the time to attend when you see something that looks like it would be of interest to you. It's on a Wednesday. I'm sorry, my watch. So Wednesday, yeah. But anyway, also I attended the Palmer City Council meeting the other day. Congratulations for not living in Palmer, but I also, as a past president of AML and board member, I invited them. I told them they were welcome to attend as well with their people. So if they show up, hopefully they won't be nearly as argumentative as they are at their council meeting. And
You'll be buying lunch.
we'll go from there. But anyway, so hopefully we will see everybody. Is that the 20th?
Yes,
Yeah.
Wednesday the 20th.
Wednesday,
And-
the 20th,
and
9 a.m. Please contact the clerk's office if you have any questions about exactly what those sessions are and what the plan time is. So, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Councilmember Velock.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And yeah, I streamed that meeting, that Palmer Council meeting. I did see you there, so. But then I fell asleep. It was pretty long and boring. And I woke up, whoa, must be over. Thank you for everything, Holly, for all your hard work. And yay, we're seeing an end, right? That's great. And I will be leaving the state for a couple of weeks, starting Wednesday. So I hope to call in next council
Monday.
meeting. And then I know you have presentations on the 3rd and 4th. I get home really early the morning of the 4th. So I can come to that presentation that night, though. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Johnson.
No comment, Mayor.
Councilmember Rubio.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Holly, awesome job tonight. The light is at the end of the tunnel. We're getting there. So excited for that. Thank you.
Councilmember Cottle.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Eric, Planning Department. I appreciate all the work that you put into this. I really, Cindy, appreciated your comments about working also with licensing and picking up information like that. Knowledge is power. And I think anytime that you can head off a problem, when you're welcoming and working, with somebody, that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Sometimes it's worth a whole lot more than that, and it's worth a lot of goodwill. So I really like seeing that interaction between departments and that sharing of information, working together, and I hope to keep it up. And that's it.
Okay, Councilmember Crafton.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to bring to council just something that was in the code that Cindy across the room pointed out to me is still in here. So recently we had some people here with some current concerns around zoning. And so we had some of the neighbors testifying their concerns. And if you just wanted to look at it more something as a food for thought, on page 25 of the new version of the code, number 8, is the portion of the code that our acting planner was able to utilize to essentially bring compliance to the current owner of the property. The way it reads is currently how it exists in our current code and is basically being carried over into the new code. So I just wanted to at least bring your attention to it, that that's where that was and basically essentially what happened there. And if, again, keep in mind it going forward if it's something you still wanted to see exist. Other than that, as the clerk had mentioned, I've already been thinking about the end to Title 16. My thoughts on this would be a hard and fast by the end of March with this. I'd like to see it done because that's going to give time hopefully give time for the people that would be utilizing specifically the landscaping portion of this to get the ball in motion so that they could utilize this plan appropriately for the coming year. I know that honestly feels like tomorrow in our world because it's going to be here a lot faster. But I would look to see, my big question is going to be for Holly on this one. We discussed a lot around revising some of this and you potentially bringing something back. Are we going to have a new revised version that incorporated some of the changes to it, or are we going to work off of this existing copy that we have in front of us when we get to the point where we're amending it officially and have action items in front of us?
So the intent was, we've been, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of times when we're going through changes, I'll be like, on line 7 on page X, Councilmember Crafton wants to see X, Y, or Z, no objection, right? That is because, we have a paralegal who is going through each one of those things and making all of the procedural and all the changes she can. So that should be pretty up to date. Some of the more substantive changes she just flags, and then we'll go back and revisit those once we're all done, which is now, and so what you'll get is this ordinance with a number with all of those changes and a memo that accompanies this memo that came with this ordinance, sort of saying, here are the changes from council members' work session draft. And how we do that, just make sure we're not creating too much paper for the public, but we produce enough paper so they can follow the changes from the existing code in a red line as best they can, and they have a memo that substantively goes through those changes, which we already have. In part, we have a 26-page memo, which is pretty thorough. And then another memo that just says, as the work sessions through the divisions resulted in X, Y, and Z. you know, and these are the changes that you should see. Here are the questions that remain outstanding, because there are some questions where council was not sure, you guys were, you know, there wasn't this consensus feel, and so there will still be some work to do at it, before adoption, I imagine, after you hear public testimony and you think through, but we'll hone in on those very specific things that were left outstanding.
So we're not gonna see a completely revised copy, but more of just, here's some additional documentation on some of the changes that we're gonna, or that you would like to put in there, is that what I'm understanding?
What do you mean by completely?
Like,
You're
I'm not
going to
gonna get a whole nother binder.
You're gonna get a brand new ordinance
brand-
with a
brand new
number
binder.
that is, but I don't know that, I would keep your binder.
Right.
And then what the packet will have, you know, the packet will have references to these, the packet is going to grow, your binder probably will not. The only thing I would say is since we will be engaging with the public in theory more, you know, then you may wanna make sure that we have reference that they are referring to the same numbers as council. So that might be something to talk to the clerk's office. So as I say that, you may be getting a new binder. I mean, just so that the packet, when we're saying I'm on page 16, they should have the same 16 in front of them. Whereas through this work session practice, which is very appropriate, we are using numbers in a binder that really is, you know, in the domain of council. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I was hoping for a new binder is what I was hoping
Oh, okay,
for.
then yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Cause
You're
then I
getting
could
a
just
binder.
transfer my comments from here into the new binder and use the new binder and put this one off to the side at that time is what I'm asking more so. With that in mind, I know it sounds like next week we're really probably gonna put a little bit more of a, hey, what our next steps are, but I'd say we should really consider January as putting a little bit more hard work into this. Next month, we already have a busy month. It's the holiday season and we have, was it 5 special meetings and 1 regular meeting in December, or 5 total meetings in there? Either way, we've got a lot in December already, plus we have AML, so just something to think about. I'm up for, again, putting some really heavy work in this. I'd like to see this done before we get too far into springtime so that people can utilize this. We have a lot of people that have been waiting on this for a very, very long time. So I think that's all. Thank you, everybody, again. Thanks for all the hard work. Thank you, Holly, and we will see you guys next week.
Okay. Thank you to Holly. A lot of hard work went into this, and to planning staff, Eric, everybody that has an opinion in all of this, and to the council. It's been long overdue, but here we are. So they will be a very good product come out of this that I think all of us can be very proud of. And with that, with no further business at hand, I'm adjourning the meeting unless an objection is raised. Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned at 8:20 p.m.